start now. Good evening, everyone. So this space is really meant to have sort of like an update on the emergency economic stabilization plan that a group of us, including Umesh, Thilina, Chayu, myself, and several others, had presented about 3 weeks ago on the 8th of April. So between these 3 weeks, I mean, it has been a very eventful past 3 weeks. Feels like a lot longer than 3 weeks. So we thought it's a good time to have a discussion and see what the progress is, and to also address any clarifications and questions that those who had read the plan may have. So Thilina and Chayu, just I can invite you guys to speak.
Sure. Thanks, Rehana. I think Umesh should also be joining us soon, perhaps, of course.
Yes.
Power cuts, of course, affecting all of us these days. I just got back from a power cut. I'm not entirely sure why. I'm supposed to have one until, I think, 7:30. But, the Lord gives the power that as it wishes, it seems. So, I think over the last few weeks, and especially since, I think, the March 31st protests really started, a lot of things, like you said, have changed. And in that emergency stabilization plan that we signed on to, a lot of things that we're talking about are in the process of happening. But the thing is, none of them have really fully happened yet. So then that's I think, except perhaps you can talk about the interest rate idea that has, of course, happened quite sharply, but how that's gotten reflected on the economy is still not fully there, and whether we have real interest rates is an overall question. But I think that the overall perspective, just to kind of start off with, would be that a lot of the things that are required to be done, right, from a very standard point of view, things that are very straightforward, right? If we have a massive tax shortfall, things that what should be done, that tax shortfall has led to XYZ issues over the years. Have to start taking action to against that. Even we have a lot of money printing that's causing a lot of inflation through the process of depreciation. Have to take steps against that. When you have debt that we can't pay, move for a debt restructuring. When we need to get some sort of bridging finance, both from the IMF, but also from our bilateral partners, start negotiating that. So a lot of that has started. So in that context, it's a positive development on the economic policy side. But not all of that, or rather very few of that, have actually properly happened. And out of that, things that are also very critical and very urgent, things like, for example, cash transfers to vulnerable sections of the population, these are not necessarily things that have really ended up happening, or there isn't a lot of progress or even communication on that. So from my personal point of view, I think it's that we've taken steps and we're starting to take steps, but a combination of factors, both the fact that the political situation is very volatile, very unstable, but also the fact that we waited so long before we started taking actions, meant that the situation on the ground for people is very volatile. It's very difficult for people to deal with the consequences of what we're going through, both the consequences of what caused the problem to come here, but also the fact that specific policies have specific impacts on the people as well. So all of that combined, I think, is slowing down the process, and that's not necessarily a positive development in my view. But of course, there is still, there's still a long way to go, and we'll have to kind of go through it. And in that meantime, do whatever we can to, make sure the process is smoothest and like least harmful though for Sri Lankan citizens, and those of us who are able to bear more of the burden at every point should ultimately, do our best in order down the process. And that's not necessarily a positive development in my view. But of course, there is still, there's still a long way to go, and we'll have to kind of go through it. And in that meantime, do whatever we can to, make sure the process is smoothest and like least harmful though for Sri Lankan citizens, and those of us who are able to bear more of the burden at every point should ultimately, do our best in order to do so, so that others are able to get at least a little bit of breathing space. That's my personal view, and I think Umesh is here now as well. Hello, Umesh.
Oh, hi. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Right. Okay. You want me to add my 2 cents, or we'll go for Thilina?
Of course, yes.
Right. So basically, there's been a lot said about this. I don't know. A lot of it would sound like repetition, but what I would say mainly is that this is this crisis is unprecedented. So there's no textbook direct answer, one or two for this. That's why we have laid out several reforms that we need immediately to get out of the crisis, right? So two things. Firstly, there are actions that we need immediately, right? For example, bridging finance, and because our reserves are running extremely low, I don't even know whether we have probably even 50 million reserves as of we speak now, which means it is not sure that whether we have sufficient foreign currency to import is required to run the country in next week. So the situation is that bad. Because situation is that bad, it is very important. It is very important that we bring in bridging finance as soon as we how this comes and where this comes is, I think, an ongoing discussion. And what are the channels that comes in also would be whether it's a credit line, or whether it's IMF, World Bank, ADB. That also can be discussed, but I think it's important to focus a lot on the bridging finance as of now. And then there's the concern about.
Sorry, Umesh, I think you've muted yourself.
Sorry. There was a bit of a connection issue. Right. So I was saying about the bridging finances, and then we need to expedite the debt restructuring process. As of now, it doesn't seem the process is going very quickly, because we don't see the discussions happening with the private creditors as of yet. So this process needs to be expedited, and that we haven't seen finalizing financial and legal advisors. We would expect that this to happen quite soon. The government already done what is needed to be done, but it's just a matter of finalizing what needs to be. I mean, who's going to be financial and legal advisors. But the thing is, while we get the debt restructuring sorted, and while we get the IMF program sorted, as these things going to take a few months. Up until then, we need immediate measures. One, as I said, is to get the bridging finance, so we get enough foreign currency to make sure that the country has enough fuel, sufficient level of electricity supply, food, medicine, and the basic needs. Because I think that should be the number one priority. And also, we see a significant part of the population is affected by what's going on now due to two reasons. One, because of the shortages and so on and so forth, and then the high price levels. High price levels, in my opinion, is uh, really a big concern, and the concern that cannot be immediately addressed as of we are right now. So what I would think is, it's important to focus that part of the population as well, and making sure that they uh, they also get whatever the support. There's a lot of discussion about what sort of support that should be provided to the vulnerable population, but that support needs to be given immediately, because they're already struggling. And then so that should be like an immediate concern. And then along in the way, you think about what the remaining reforms that needs to be carried out. I think we can talk about the specifics. So I'll leave it at that as opening remarks.
Thilina?
Yes. I think of course Chayu and Umesh have covered some of most of the immediate things and the things that have happened. So from my side, I think what I would like to add is, while we've done a lot of the immediate kind of things that we had procrastinated a lot on, the rate hikes, the currency adjustment, getting a credible team to handle from the governor, the secretary treasury, all of that has been done, and partly all of that happened because the impetus that is brought by the protest. And from here onwards, the actions to be taken will also take time, is my feeling. And it's important for us to also set practical and realistic timelines and deadlines, for when these things can be achieved, so that we don't get disappointed along the way. And that kind of unrealistic deadlines, timelines could also affect the confidence, the trust, and the credibility within the new team and the whole process that we need to go from here onwards now to finalizing an IMF program, finalizing the debt restructuring. This is, a process that would take the next 12 months to really finalize. So I think it's important to set those realistic timelines going forward. And of course, even when it comes to the fiscal reforms that are required, there would be immediate things like containing expenditure for the immediate situation, and then trying to raise revenue going forward. So those will need to happen. But I think for me the critical thing right now is setting those realistic deadlines, timelines, so that we don't get overly disappointed, which affects confidence, and of course the functioning of the forex market, the bond markets, because those things functioning properly is vital to get the imports cleared, to keep the government funded for to pay the salaries, to do the welfare programs. So I think that to me is right now also an important thing for us, because yes, we are talking about all of these things, but also at the same time we are also in the sidelines. So there's only a very those who are actually doing all these processes. We need to be realistic about what they are able to achieve in the midst of everything that's happening.
Yeah, I think the sense of urgency is is very profound, and I think the IMF the discussions that the government had last week were probably very eye-opening. It's not something that you can course correct overnight. So I think what the IMF has said is that until they see a proper debt restructuring plan and commitment to that path, that we will not be able to receive financial assistance from them. But I think it's we have taken the first tentative steps in the right direction. But so our plan covered about 12 different points, and we can see that on some of them there has been some action, on some of them not really. So just want to stress that it's important to tackle the situation from all the different angles. Like, we don't have to wait for IMF, for example, to start thinking about how we are going to roll out a social assistance program. We can start doing that in advance, and we don't have to wait for IMF to start deciding on how we are going to trim government expenditure to make the fiscal space for this kind of program available. So I think there's a lot that can be done, simultaneously while carrying on the IMF discussions and the debt restructuring discussions. So yeah, I think it's the sense of urgency that I would say is kind of seems to be maybe not not something that I'm seeing. Yeah, so I'd just like to invite the audience members, if there's anybody who would like to come in and ask a question from any of us, to please send a request to speak, and I will approve that, and then you can ask the questions that you wish. Yeah, till then, I thought there was a lot of discussion recently on the Twitter timeline about the cash transfer program that all of us are talking about, and it's good to see that nobody is denying the fact that there has to be a program of this nature. It's just that it's the nitty-gritty of it that's being debated. So I just one of the biggest question is, how do we create the fiscal space for this kind of program? So I was just wondering if any of you guys had any thoughts on that.
I can give a broad picture on some of those things and the
Yes,
overall
sure.
space of it, and I think perhaps Umesh might be able to talk a little bit about the nitty-gritties and even the administrative difficulties there. But one thing I see in the on the welfare side, essentially, regardless of the process of how we do it, what we want to do is give as much support as possible to the people for whom that support is really necessary. And we want to do it in a way that doesn't burden them as well. Because one thing that I think a lot of the time, especially in the Sri Lankan context, part that gets missed is any expenditure we do, any subsidy we provide, any welfare payment we make has to be financed, like the money has to come from somewhere. Over the last 2 years or so, because we kept interest rates low, that has essentially come through the money printing mechanism. And we see the consequences of that today, right? Having a lot of money printing meant that a lot of money went into consumption, which went into imports, which went in, caused money to leave the country, caused official and unofficial depreciation, and caused a lot of inflation. And we're seeing the impacts of that started when that unofficial rate had started diverging sometime last year, and we're still seeing that the impacts of that today. Now, the reason I want to bring that up at this point is that it is therefore critical to understand what we can do right now and the overall space of where we can really get it. So I think in that context, my feeling is that when there are methods that are financing methods, for example, if it's raising taxes, will take some time to bring in some revenue, especially in the context like Sri Lanka's economy this year. How much revenue it brings in this year is going to be a question altogether. So then what other options do we have? From what I understand, there is the possibility of, for example, of some financing coming in from the World Bank for welfare payments. I think even one of some of the more recent statements from the World Bank themselves also refer to the possibility of some of that financing being for that, and that could be a significant amount as well. But it doesn't necessarily have to be limited to that. Like Rehana, you mentioned as well, we don't have to wait for anyone. We can start the process, and I think one other thing there to be very aware of is that the situation that Sri Lanka is in, and critical the situation Sri Lanka was in, and was the pathway that we were on was one that was barreling down towards a lot of pain. So in and of itself, moving away from that pathway is a kind of a welfare payment to the entire country in a way. I'm not saying that it fixes anything, but a reduction of pain is important and key thing in and of itself. Now, it's beyond that, we need to make sure that there is additional support being given, and that's of course where that space comes in, whether it comes from money printing in the short term, and whether the costs of that outweigh the benefits, whether we can do it through taxes, whether we had to wait for some sort of financing to come in from abroad, or is there some sort of short-term capital expenditure we can cut down on, for example, that we can then divert into a short-term money printing program until the full impact of it comes from, for example, say a World Bank funding line. So there are different things to that question. There are options, but I think it's important then to like look at the costs of each of those options critically and not just disregard that. And then, of course, the administrative realities of how to implement all of these things also come into play. So that's what I'd like to add from my view.
I will add a little bit of to what Chayu said. As he said, it's important to figure out where the finances are coming to a social safety net program. Am I audible?
Yes.
Right. So it's important to understand, figure out from where the finances will, or rather the funds will come to a social safety net program. My hunch is that in the short term, we will have to reduce some capital expenditure, which I think we can see that there are some efforts from the treasury to reduce some capital expenditure and diverge. What we could do is diverge those funds for couple of months to social safety net programs. But it is important to emphasize that when we talk about this, we are talking about additional social security, not the existing ones. And why we need additional is because there's significant rising cost of living, and that has resulted in number of people facing enormous difficulties. Most of there could be number of people who actually had become poor, like rather falling below the poverty line because of the significant increase of cost of living. So that needs additional support for them. So that is what we are talking about, is in addition to what has been already been provided. And I am optimistic that the World Bank will actually give some support for social safety net programs, because they have been doing this, and then idea is that some kind of support will come in for the upcoming few years. Now, talking about the administrative side, it is important that we realize there are two issues here. One, how do we what are we giving as social security, and that side, right, more of the policy side. Then there's administrative side. We shouldn't mix administration and policy. Administration is something that needs to be fixed regardless, whether that is social security, whether that is tax, whether that is public administration. Sri Lanka has a big problem when it comes to administration, inland revenue, customs, all of it. These things needs to be fixed regardless, right? So I don't think anyone would disagree with that. So it is important that make this an urgent need. I think the crisis is calling for such a need as well, right? So it's important to push that. And in doing so, what we need to understand is there's already work being done on this regard. There was a World Bank project, social safety net project, started in 2016, working together with the Ministry of Finance. So they have done quite a lot of work in terms of identifying who needs social security and bringing all the social security into one program. And there's been plan to digitize the Samurti Bank records, so on and so forth. That has not been very successful, I would say. So there's plans, but there's been work also done regarding identifying and verifying who needs social security, their income. There's been surveys, and I was told that there's been a pilot survey done in last year as well, using electronic devices, so on and so forth. So there's been work done already. What we need right now is expedite that and make that process sort of digitized, so that those who receive social welfare does not face administrative difficulties. And that is not an issue that cannot be resolved. That can be resolved. You just need that bit of a restructuring the resources from the places where it is right now to where it is required, and streamlining processes. So that can go along. That not actually that has to go along with the whatever the kind of support that is decided to provide it. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, personally, I think like we do have a variety of different social assistance programs, but I think just because this is crisis focused, there has to be a sort of a consolidated program where everybody is brought under one umbrella, and then you disburse benefits through that, rather than running a variety of different programs simultaneously. Just because I think like we can optimize the limited resources we have if we do that. For example, we can cut down sort of the duplicating administrative work and the administration cost. So just wanted to add that there. Thilina, you were going to say something, I think.
Yeah, so I think, and I agree with you overall, welfare situation and the implementation side of it. But I also realized that there is in terms of, trying to figure out how much of, a cash payment, etc., is, required, on a monthly basis or weekly basis or whatever the frequency that is chosen. Because right now the foreign exchange market is volatile such that the exchange rate keeps pushing higher and higher. And that is also pushing up the cost of living, whether it's for fuel or for food, imported food prices, that keeps pushing up the cost of living. So I think a very immediate, in the very near term, what is also required is that bridging finance to come, so that the confidence and sentiment in the foreign exchange market also allows that exchange rate to stabilize at a place where you can then see some stability in terms of prices, and therefore decide, okay, this is now the level of cash transfer that will be required to support the vulnerable groups in terms of their cost of living. I think that's also an important thing, because it's the volatility that we're facing. Otherwise, we also have that issue of credibility, saying, okay, look, you all said 5,000 is enough, but they just raised oil prices again by another 50 rupees. So that again is I think for the credibility of the program is also important on that side, for that exchange rate, the forex market stability to also be established. And I think part of that is also getting sufficient bridging finance, and also getting the essential imports in through that financing as well, because otherwise we'll also be throwing money into people's hands, but they won't have the essentials in the market to purchase. So that is also something to consider in the practicalities of how this should be paced out.
Yes, I think you're right. And I don't think we have seen the full impact on the cost of living yet, because, for example, electricity tariffs are yet to be revised. And I think that's probably something that is also likely to get revised, similar to the fuel cost. So obviously that will again impact on the cost of living. So I think Chayu had tweeted recently about how our forex reserves are only about 3 days worth. So that is a pretty scary situation. And as you and Umesh both said, bridge financing is important to shore up, our forex reserves. Dilshani, you had joined in to ask a question, I think. You can, go ahead.
Yeah. Hi, I sort of have a couple of questions and a comment on cash transfers, because I deal with poverty statistics. The first question is, why is the debt restructuring taking so long, and are consultants, in the sense, are economists currently being consulted at the moment for the debt restructuring at this point? Because as far as I know, Minister Ali Sabri has gone to IMF, and I don't know the credibility of his in terms of economics, but are economists being consulted at this point? and how practical at this point, how efficient is debt restructuring at this point, that I would like to know. The second is, the World Bank had given us a credit, a loan sort of, which I recently heard. In terms of allocating the funds, what is the hierarchy of allocating these funds in terms of expenditures from the government perspectives? Is it allocated for medicine and um, other necessities, or what is the hierarchy of using that efficiently? And the third is a comment on with respect to the cash transfers. Recently, a study done by the World Bank had revealed that most of the poverty had shifted to urban poor. So instead of Samurdhi, a new targeting should be done with respect to cash transfers. So that I have to bring up. Thanks.
I'll start on and give a comment on the debt restructuring and the IMF negotiations, since that's an area of expertise for me. So in terms of the debt restructuring and the IMF's two separate things. For the debt restructuring, as they've asked for proposals for legal and financial advisors. Recently, they said like a total of over 50 applications had come in, and they're choosing between them now. So that from that context, for the debt restructuring, we haven't appointed anyone yet. That legal and financial advisory firm that would support us in talking to our creditors. That hasn't happened yet, so that's one thing that has been delayed for sure. That's has to be done. We need to appoint them, but beyond that as well, there is probably still going to be delay because there are lots of things to talk about. Recently, China, for example, had talked about whether they want to be part of debt restructuring, how they are looking at it, what the requirement that Sri Lanka might have from them might be. So all of these are things that play into each other and make that whole situation very kind of messy. So the debt restructuring immediately happening is very unlikely. It's going to take some time, but as a first step, we need to finalize that legal and financial advisory firm for the debt restructuring. In terms of the IMF negotiations and, for example, Mr. Ali Sabri go in there, I don't think that's very much a very specific problem, because he would be representing the political side of the equation, and that's why, for example, the central bank governor and the secretary of treasury, both of whom are considered far more credible in terms of their economic and financial understanding and that background, they also are part of that program. And usually the IMF would be dealing with the Minister of Finance or the Minister of Finance directly on a political way, or as talking to someone from a political capacity, while the officials, the actual government officials who are more career central bankers, career financial officials, career treasury officials, are going to be the ones kind of negotiating the technicalities of it. I mean, just another example is that when I think our last IMF program also was negotiated along with Mr. Mangal Samaravir, who was of course not a finance professional himself either. So I don't think that necessarily is a issue for the IMF, as long as you have someone, especially like the other officials themselves are also part of that process. I don't think there's a credibility issue from the IMF's point of view, but I do very much understand that locally, for the process to have credibility, there can be issues because you're essentially having a member of the government that the people are protesting against. So that can be an issue, but that's more about the local legitimacy of the process rather than perhaps what the IMF themselves would think. So I think on the debt restructuring IMF part, that's what I would have to say. Maybe the others can butt in on the rest.
With respect to like the aid or the support we've been getting, rather pledged to us from places like the World Bank, and also I think the Italian and Indonesian embassies have also pledged some support for us. So I think that will depend on the donor itself. Whether they decide to give us cash, or whether they decide to give us, say, medicines that they bring, they pay the supplier and bring it in. I guess that would be up to the individual program itself. So I don't think it's possible to comment at the moment on that. I think on the Chayu.
Sorry, I just remembered one point on the World Bank numbers that we just spoken about. I think that was also something Dilshan is asked about. Was that so far, I don't think the World Bank themselves confirmed this 600 million, 400 million number. So far, it comes from the president's office. So usually a World Bank financing, as I understanding, would come with more, unless it's given as overall budgetary support. I think it would come with very clear guidelines on what it to be for. And
yes,
so I mean, on that specific thing, I think we'll have to wait for some communication from the World Bank to see what it is. But I mean, I understand, of course, there are always going to be concerns over the our corruption and the like, given the current climate that we are in. but we'll have to probably wait for what the World Bank themselves specifically said about their guidelines on that specific payment is to apply.
Rehana, may I add one thing
Yes,
to that?
Umesh, go ahead.
World Bank. So World Bank usually give funding for specific projects, which means they don't give you, I mean, unless it's a budgetary support. At this point, the fund is likely to give for a specific purpose. So there's we can't really prioritize it. So they give, like, let's say, for this is for medical supply, this is specifically for medical. That is how they will provide funding. And usually for World Bank to finalize a project and give it, that takes a bit of a time. But I think given the urgency of needs, what is likely to happen is shifting some of the already going on World Bank project funding to the urgent needs. For example, there's been 10 million sort of a reallocation or reprofiling of health funding for urgent medical imports. That I know that has happened. So something along those lines, where through the ongoing program, to already committed amounts, which means World Bank has already agreed to provide these loans, but still these will be provided across number of years, and then that funding will be directed towards the urgent needs that Sri Lanka is having now in terms of addressing the immediate concerns. And then whatever the additional funding will take a little bit longer, whether it's a social safety net or whether it's a kind of thing that the 600 million or whatever the government is talking about. We'll have to wait and see what World Bank says. That's one point about the one point where priority becomes important is the Indian credit line. There's 1 billion Indian credit line that is being discussed. So in which Sri Lanka intend to import intermediate goods, food supply, medicine, gas, fuel through the credit line. So there the priority becomes a concern. Again, I think this credit line will include fair bit of a fuel because we don't have any other way of getting fuel. And then I think medicine is also priority, and then there's intermediate goods, food supply, and etc. In terms of gas, India, as far as I know, others can correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think India is sort of a gas producer, so that probably this gas, the allocation for the gas might be reallocated to fuel, medicine, or food also. But as far as I know, from the credit line, food, fuel, and medicine has been prioritized, and some part was allocated to intermediate goods as well, because that's also important to keep the export industries going.
Yes, absolutely. Sanjima, you had joined us. If you would like to ask your question.
Yeah, thank you. It's about the assistance to households, basically. So in addition to government, obviously there'll be a lot of private assistance. And often in crisis situations, assistance ends up becoming very inefficiently distributed. Is there any framework or any tools that have been considered for managing that or coordinating that, so that people can, if one household is getting assistance from one person, then we don't duplicate and triplicate. We kind of coordinate and deliver it better. And also for being able to deliver that assistance in form of maybe I pay for buying, one gas cylinder for the family, like thing.
Yeah, I think that's why I mentioned earlier that there has to be some sort of consolidation across the multiple social welfare programs that we have going on at the moment. Because one of the biggest sort of structural issues in it is that it's not very well coordinated. There's some level of duplicity. There's lots of inefficiencies. There are targeting issues. There are inclusion and exclusion errors where you're not really getting to the people that you really need to. So I think some attempt at a consolidated approach, like Umesh was talking about, the social safety nets program, I think that would help to a certain extent. And then there could also be certain inbuilt exemptions, like, for example, if you're also getting if someone in the household is getting a pension from the civil pension scheme, then we can exempt that household, probably because they're already getting some form of support from the government. So I think, like, it's not an easy thing to do, but I think we can. There are ways that you can sort of make it more efficient than it has been at the moment. Umesh, would you?
Yeah,
Yeah.
Rehana, yeah, small thing because Sanju specifically mentioned about this. As I mentioned before, this project has been going on since 2016. So combining all kind of social safety net programs, it is happening and there's work done. I don't know things in detail about it because in last few years I haven't been involved in this program, but during the time when I was at the Treasury, this program was going on, and this is still going on, and there are some work in recent past as well. So when we implement these reforms, I think one reference point would be to refer to what the work that has already been done, bringing all this into one net. That because that plan is there. So then it's matter of figuring out what are the what are the steps that needs to be carried out to implement this and sort of expedite the process. Because I think project has been going on for a while now. The timelines, I'm not sure, maybe wasn't be this, but maybe you could expedite the process so that everything can be brought under one system and then provide it. Earlier, the idea was to introduce what we call a welfare benefit board, under which every welfare payment is administrated. Sure how it can be done, but again, we would require some information from the particular project to see where it stands now. I think what government would need is to carry on that work that has already done and implement it in such a way that there's no duplications. But I'm optimistic that it can be done because there's a lot of groundwork has been done. It's just a matter of doing the right thing and expediting the process.
Just to add an additional point, I think because of the point that Dilshani had on the increase in urban poor as a result of the COVID recession we had and now the economic crisis we're having. One thing to consider there again is there might be increased higher inclusion of urban poor in the financial system compared to maybe other welfare recipients. So the how do you use the financial system as well within the financial and the payments infrastructure in terms of delivering the welfare payments. And also an additional point is not to make this a welfare program that is going to be a short-term fix for the trouble people are facing right now. This should be a system that we can use in the future, which is flexible, that during a flood, during droughts, that this system can be activated. So also flexibility, so that maybe in the future to have that flexibility to deliver the welfare payments in certain months when there is a hit on income, while it kind of tapers off in other periods when they might not require it to the same extent. And the same thing applies, like for example, having someone in your household that has a pension, in certain periods would disqualify you, but in periods of crisis, it might still mean that your household qualifies for an additional for a payment. So that kind of flexibility will also need to be get into the system over time. It might not be feasible to do that right now, but to see this also as a longer term project to increase the viability of the social safety net.
Rehana, if I may add something to that now,
Sure.
is that okay?
Yes,
Yeah.
go ahead.
So while trying to get government to build digital infrastructure for managing this is quite difficult for a variety of sometimes good reasons and sometimes tough, not good reasons. But I think there is a need for to build this stuff outside, and there are a lot of external contributions that are going on. And if we combine sorry, my dog's about. If you find a way to get the outside contributors to coordinate, you could probably do quite a lot of good stuff instead of just relying on government here.
Yeah, we have Dr. Samarajiva here who knows quite a lot about this. I don't know if you would like to say anything. But anyway, let's move on to another topic. Anyway, I'd just like to invite anybody else who has any questions to please send me a request and I will give you the mic so you can ask. I think the next point that, we are talking about in terms of raising revenue. Umesh, I think you can lead this conversation a bit about how we can go about sort of ramping up government tax revenue and to create, the fiscal space that we need for a lot of the for government to go on as normal to a certain extent, as well as do the sort of extraordinary programs that it has to do. This is a point that we talked about in the plan.
Right. I think it's clear that everyone agrees that tax revenue needs to go up. So as a starting point, what we need to do is go back to the tax system we had prior to 2019, before the government gave a series of tax cuts. So this means the reintroduction of pay as you earn, so that people who earn, let's say a fair bit of money, their tax is collected at the point of them receiving the salary. Now, I understand that there's a significant inflation, so the threshold can be changed, considering how the price levels have increased. But it is important that we go back to the pay as soon as we can. I think it can be done because the mechanisms are already in place, because it's a tax that existed for a longer period. And then also to increase tax rates, particularly the income tax rates, which were reduced, and the corporate tax rates, and also the reintroduction of withholding tax, in particular for certain payments which were taken away after the tax changes in 2019. So introduce these changes as the immediate step is the one. And I would also say um, increase the VAT rate a bit. We can decide based on the price levels what rate it should be. Increase the VAT rate, and also the reduce the VAT threshold, so that there'll be a lot of more businesses paying VAT. This has to happen along with reduction of what we call custom duties, and particularly reduction of para tariff. Because if you reduce the para tariff, such as cess, tal, and other such as custom duty, that means it will have a less impact on the price. Why it is important to bring VAT instead of custom duties and para tariff is that a VAT is a better tax to administer, because it is the chances to avoid paying VAT is compared to other taxes, and it makes sure that the businesses keep reporting these profits, because it works in such a way that one business can claim tax returns, so it works through a value chain, right? So that is why you would have a VAT instead of value add. The concept of value addition comes. That is why VAT is used instead of merely having a sales tax, right? So that is the reason why the VAT focus on VAT should be there. So to counter the effect of price, because you already have high inflation, you could curtail it by reducing the para tariffs in particular, so that it increases the competition and doesn't have much effect on the price level, so that a lot of businesses to the tax net as well in the longer term. But I wouldn't say that is an immediate thing. Immediately we could focus on the income tax side, but maybe in the sort of in the medium term, you could medium term as in like maybe after a few months, when the things somewhat is down, focus on that, so that there is credibility we provide to the creditors, and also for the IMF, that a part of increase in tax revenue. Of course, all these things to work, it is important to strengthen the revenue administration. We have quite a bit of problem with tax administration. No amount of policy changes would result in revenue increase unless we fix the administration. So it is an immediate requirement, as I mentioned before, is to fix tax administration issues, including the issues pertaining to the RAMIs, so that we can make sure we collect sufficient tax revenue, and there's less room for tax evasion. So this includes providing more resources to the Inland Revenue Department, sort of encourage investigations from the Inland Revenue Department, and also making sure that you get you collect a lot of tax arrays that are there in terms of income tax as well as VAT. If you look at the Inland Revenue Department annual report, you'll see there's billions of money remaining as arrays. So you could put a lot of effort in making sure to collect these things, right? So I'll leave it as the start.
Just to add on to, I think Umesh's one. I mean, I agree with obviously with the tax increases that are required in the future. I think adding on to that point about the tax administration and to build that, on the longer term, the credibility of the taxation, and of course, maintaining also the morale of the IRD, etc. The longer term and having that policy consistency is to remove, and reduce the ability of the Ministry of Finance to do the midnight gazettes, overnight changes in tax rates, tax policies, that which essentially enabled the massive tax cut that happened in 2019. That kind of overnight executive power that can be done without any real parliamentary debate or any analysis of economic impact, social impact of those policies. That power also needs to be taken away if we are to sustainably improve the tax administration side and ensure some policy consistency in the long term, because that also I think would be vital, because we are really looking at a 5 to 8 year period in the future where we need to show continued fiscal responsibility.
I want to add something on the, again, agreeing with what everything that Umesh and Thilina said on the tax revenue increases and the requirement to do that from an administrative sense as well. One thing I also want to point out is that, because it's a pathway that we've been following so far, and for someone, the four of us as well as others who are aware of the fact might understand the consequences, or rather why we are not going ahead with the money printing program. I just want to talk about that alternative once again, because it's something that will continue to be brought up. Why we can't just print money? I've seen this argument quite a lot quite recently. Why can't we just print money and provide XYZ subsidies to people? Why we can't do XYZ investments for the people? Because we have the option of printing money. Now, there are multiple reasons. I don't think money printing in and of itself is always a bad thing. It's always to do with what's the benefit of that and what's the cost, and can those two things kind of be reconciled together. For example, if I think a few weeks ago there were some salary payments that had to be made by the government, and there was no revenue in the short term, then in that context, the only way that you can make those payments, if it is money printing, that's fine. There are these kinds of short-term requirements that money printing can be used for, as long as you're both aware of the costs and that you take steps to mitigate those costs. And for money printing, the biggest cost is that when you put in a lot of money into the economy, and this is something I've said in the past, but I will continue to repeat because it's very critical. Sri Lankans will just have more money that they can use on consumption, and also when it comes to low interest rates, means companies in the country can also finance a lot of things like construction, a lot of things like financing new equipment, new machinery. A lot of imports can come into the country. Now, I think about 80% of Sri Lanka's imports are actually intermediate and machinery, investment good, building material kind of thing. So a lot of that is coming from that side of things. But we did see how in 2021, despite, mind you, import controls being on, we saw some of the biggest increases in imports as a result of that money printing, really encouraging just a lot of that imports to come in. The reason I'm bringing this up is that the consequences of money printing often mean that our welfare requirements, our expenditure requirements actually increase rather than being met, because money printing causing
I wouldn't say that is an immediate thing. Immediately we could focus on the income tax side, but maybe in the sort of in the medium term, you could medium term as in like maybe after a few months when the things somewhat is down, focus on that, so that there is credibility we provide to the creditors and also for the IMF that a part of increase in tax revenue. Of course, all these things to work, it is important to strengthen the revenue administration. We have quite a bit of problem with tax administration. No amount of policy changes would result in revenue increase unless we fix the administration. So it is an immediate requirement, as I mentioned before, is to fix tax administration issues, including the issues pertaining to the RAMIs, so that we can make sure we collect sufficient tax revenue and there's less room for tax evasion. So this includes providing more resources to the Inland Revenue Department, sort of encourage investigations from the Inland Revenue Department, and also making sure that you collect a lot of tax arrays that are there in terms of income tax as well as that. If you look at the Inland Revenue Department annual report, you'll see there's billions of money remaining as arrays. So you could put a lot of effort in making sure to collect these things. Right? So I'll leave it as the start.
Just to add on to, I think, Umesh's one, I agree with obviously with the tax increases that are required in the future. I think adding on to that point about the tax administration and to build that on the longer term, the credibility of the taxation, and of course maintaining also the morale of the IRD, etc. The longer term and having that policy consistency is to remove and reduce the ability of the Ministry of Finance to do the midnight gazettes, overnight changes in tax rates, tax policies, that which essentially enabled the massive tax cut that happened in 2019. That kind of overnight executive power that can be done without any real parliamentary debate or any analysis of economic impact, social impact of those policies. That power also needs to be taken away if we are to sustainably increase improve the tax administration side and ensure some policy consistency in the long term, because that also I think would be vital, because we are really looking at a 5 to 8 year period in the future where we need to show continued fiscal responsibility.
I want to add something on the
improve the tax administration side and ensure some policy consistency in the long term, because that also I think would be vital, because we are really looking at a 5 to 8 year period in the future where we need to show continued fiscal responsibility.
I want to add something on the, again, agreeing with everything that Umesh and Thilina said on the tax revenue increases and the requirement to do that from an administrative sense as well. One thing I also want to point out is that, because it's a pathway that we've been following so far, and for someone, the four of us as well as others who are aware of the fact might understand the consequences, or rather why we are not going ahead with the money printing program. I just want to talk about that alternative once again, because it's something that will continue to be brought up. Why we can't just print money? I've seen this argument quite a lot quite recently. Why can't we just print money and provide XYZ subsidies to people? Why we can't do XYZ investments for the people? Because we have the option of printing money. Now, there are multiple reasons. I don't think money printing in and of itself is always a bad thing. It's always to do with what's the benefit of that and what's the cost, and can those two things kind of be reconciled together. For example, if I think a few weeks ago there were some salary payments that had to be made by the government, and there was no revenue in the short term, then in that context, the only way that you can make those payments, if it is money printing, that's fine. There are these kinds of short-term requirements that money printing can be used for, as long as you're both aware of the costs and that you take steps to mitigate those costs. And for money printing, the biggest cost is that when you put in a lot of money into the economy, and this is something I've said in the past, but I will continue to repeat because it's very critical. Sri Lankans will just have more money that they can use on consumption, and also when it comes to low interest rates, means companies in the country can also finance a lot of things like construction, a lot of things like financing new equipment, new machinery. A lot of imports can come into the country. Now, I think about 80% of Sri Lanka's imports are actually intermediate and machinery, investment good, building material kind of thing. So a lot of that is coming from that side of things. But we did see how in 2021, despite, mind you, import controls being on, we saw some of the biggest increases in imports as a result of that money printing, really encouraging just a lot of that imports to come in. The reason I'm bringing this up is that the consequences of money printing often mean that our welfare requirements, our expenditure requirements actually increase rather than being met, because money printing causing imports, causing depreciation, causing inflation, means that the actual requirement of money that you need to spend once again goes up. So money that you put into the economy through money printing often ends up requiring more money to be put into another means. So ultimately what that requires is that the more and more immediate measures that you need to take in for tax increases. So for example, immediately putting in a very high VAT might become a future requirement if we keep printing money, as opposed to something that we can do in a more gradual sense, or in a way that allows for to reduce the impacts onto the consumer. So I just wanted to bring up that question of the alternative ways to finance these kinds of things, as opposed to tax revenue and government revenue and money printing pathway once again, because the alternative is very, very bad. It's something that we currently experience the consequences of, and I think it's important and critical to keep referencing that, so that we don't forget as we go on and we move away from those shortages, that we don't forget that a key part of the shortages, the key part of the price rises that we're seeing did stem from us choosing to reduce taxes and instead finance the government through that money printing pathway.
Yes, and I just like to add to that point, Chayu, like if we take a look at the government's direct borrowings from the central bank in between 2019 and 20, there was a 180% increase. So obviously, because the government was cut off from international financing markets, it didn't, and obviously with COVID and stuff, there was no other, I mean, obviously the money printing, and there was no other choice to fund this massive budget deficit that the government put up, right? So yes, and broad money was expanded about 40% in between those 2 years. So now, since the policy rate was increased, we are seeing that the government is able to shift its borrowing to the domestic markets more than the central bank. So that's a good thing, because then you're not creating money, you're borrowing existing money. So that's why we say that it will have an impact on stabilizing the prices, because right now what was happening, if not, was that the rupee was depreciating and the cost of living was going up, and then there were also like forex shortages, which were affecting the supply chain, and that was contracting production. So this policy rate hike was something that was very important and necessary. It may have come, I guess, a little too late, but it came nonetheless, so that's a good thing. And I think we're starting to see some impact from that. If there's anybody else who would like to ask a question, please feel free.
Rehana, I've got a message from someone.
Okay, sure.
So I'll read it out.
Mm-hmm.
One is, are there minor things Sri Lankans could do to increase foreign revenue? Other parties, all these discussions about timelines and framework need to be done were discussed in many forums, but nothing happened until we go there, find out the same information again. So all the other things are being talked about here need a lot of revamping of the government services. When and if the current environment settles down, won't things go back to the same system? So there's one question about things going back to the same system, other one about minor things Sri Lankans could do to increase foreign revenue.
Yeah, I think at the moment, like, take our the industries which earn a lot of dollars for Sri Lanka, like the IT sector, tea, apparels. I think all of them have been affected because of the forex shortage. They haven't been able to get the raw materials, or have a full day's supply of electricity to run their businesses. So I think it's probably like helping those industries come back to a normal stage, like a stage of normalcy, and then ramping up from that will probably take a bit longer, I think, and is not something that will happen immediately. So it's probably more like a medium to longer term strategy that the country needs to have.
I'll add one point to that because the question was about increasing foreign currency earnings. One issue that we have currently is that significant part of foreign currency earnings are not coming through official channels. Because of the government decision to hold the rupee for about 1 year or so, people shifted to the grey markets, people shifted to the unofficial channels and used to it. And then there was enough time for them to continue to use these unofficial channels. Now people are reluctant to shift back to the official channels, and on top of that, there's a big confidence issue in the economy. There's a crisis of confidence and political instability, because when we tell people to shift to the official channels, there's a huge confidence issue. I think I have encountered this. I think Chayu and Thilina had also mentioned to me that they've also encountered this. When we tell people, they say that, okay, if we send money through official channels, those money would be stolen. That's that narrative. Whether that narrative is in the economic sense correct or not doesn't really matter, because that's what people would want. People keep saying that we want the change for us to do XYZ things, including shifting to the official channel. So that issue is actually, I would say, quite a big concern that needs to be addressed, and this is why it is important that the political authorities also realizing that there's a confidence issue and they need to take bold steps for economy to be recovered. Right, so I'll leave it at that, but probably Chayu or Thilina can add to this as well.
I'll let a quick point on the fact that on one reason why we might not get back to the same system that was part of that question is, I mean, the sad reason for that is that our situation right now is so absolutely terrible. That means what usually happens, and that's why we've gone to the IMF in the past. We've done this before, but we've changed track, and that's why we continue to go to the IMF. That's why we continue to have these balance of payment crises once every few years. The reason we've been able to do that in the past is because a year or two of reform gets you to a place, gets the country's economy to a place where you can ignore that reform part and you can go back to something else. The difference this time is our country is in a far worse place. I mean, reserves being at what? I mean, my estimate was about 3 days of imports. Umesh was saying, and it's possible, right? Like that was at end March. Whatever happened in April, perhaps it has fallen even further. That means that there is no real space for us to change track. Like we have to continue on this pathway. The moment we try to change track, we very quickly get into trouble again, as opposed to as in the past we might have gotten in trouble 3 years down the line after changing track. Now we're going to get in trouble 1, 2, 3 months in the future. So there's really no space for us to change track until some significant change has been done to the economy. And it's something that in some other countries we've also seen. Of course, the way those countries achieved that result is very different. For example, India in 1991 went through a similar process of massive reform in the economy. The way that happened again was different. The Asian financial crisis countries went through big reform. Again, the way that happened was slightly different. But when you're in such a deep crisis, there's actually not the possibility of reversal is also very, very low. So that's one thing that could, if we can stay on this reform path for long enough, and that we are forced to stay on that path long enough because of the fragility of the system, then it is possible that we set up enough systems in the meantime, our institutions become stronger, financial, and of course our other political institutions as well, as a result of the crisis, and that leads to us ending up in a year or two in a place that is much harder for us to get back to where we were, because the whole system has essentially changed for the better. I'm not saying that things will become perfect and Sri Lanka will become the next Singapore or anything, but an improvement from where we were is very possible. And in my personal opinion, I think it's more likely than not that we will see an improvement in the system. The political protests publicly the public protests rather, are a big driver for that. But I do think that optimism is something that we could have looking into the year's future, and that it doesn't necessarily have to go back to essentially square one.
Yeah, I think I agree with you, Chayu, because now is a good time as any to start thinking about how do we avoid an 18th IMF program, right? And the only way to do that is if we commit to a path of reforms, and then, as you said, we don't sort of U-turn or reverse somewhere along the line when things are a little bit more comfortable.
Yeah, I think on that note, there is also a question of what our thoughts are on in terms of the loss-making SOEs as well.
Yes, I was just going to cover that.
Just make a comment on the informal money transfer thing.
Yes.
Please. So there was a comment about the lack of trust in the public in the formal system, saying somebody might steal the money or whatever if you send it. But there's the other side too, which is that many people didn't trust the informal system. It doesn't feel as clean, but and many of them were forced to use it because the differential in value was too much. And now you get used to this mode of, this system actually works and you can trust it, and you get additional value. So why in the world would you come back?
Yes, that's a very good point as well. I think as long as the differential is significant enough, then the informal market, like for people who are just looking at it from terms of what they get as in terms of what they get as value for their money, that's something that will be then. I mean, usually that differential goes down to I think about 3 to 5%. I think it was, or 3 to 5 rupees. When the banking systems, forex markets are properly functional. Right now, the inflows and outflows don't really work out. But they're not really matching the debt inflows, the non-debt inflows, the export earnings, all of that, not really matching our outflow requirement. So until that matching ends up happening one way or the other, there is the possibility of the informal market existing. But of course, there can be other non-cost related factors. And I think that's also what Umesh was talking about, that can convince someone perhaps to come into the formal market. But on the other hand, that even if you have that, the banking system functioning properly and the forex market functioning properly, there'll still be people who, for other confidence related reasons, still don't come into the formal system. So there is a lot of there are a lot of the damage is already done essentially, and getting out of that will be tough. There's no question about it.
Yes, I mean, right now there's just no dollars, right? So obviously there's a shortage. So that's probably why we are seeing the exchange, at least the official exchange rate overshooting. But I think as probably the dollars start flowing in the medium to longer term, we can see the exchange rate sort of settling a little bit lower than it is now. So we have a question coming in. Elephant in the room is the SOE debt and the circular debt of CEB, CPC, Sri Lankan Airlines, and state banks. What do you guys recommend in this regard, short term and long term? Likely that the IMF will also ask for SOE reforms, like they did in the 2016 extended fund facility.
I think this is one where different people can have very different views on. I'll give my view on SOE reform and how my personal view on how that could go in the Sri Lankan context. I think there are significant parts of these SOEs. For example, CPC's losses as a result of the fact that let's say if they get 100 rupees from a customer and then you have to go and pay 200 to get your oil, that's like 100 rupee loss there. And that loss has to be financed through borrowing from the state banking system, and you really don't want the state banking system under stress, right? The state banking system being under significant stress is far worse than petrol prices going up, and the costs of those are not really comparable at all. So I mean, in context like that, I think making sure that there are not such big losses, whatever that process may be, is one key thing that's required, because the costs of those losses continuing is very, very bad. So in that context, I think those losses should, for these individual SOEs that have such bad consequences, should be handled. Other SOEs, things like SLA, airline service, again, when you have these individual costs that have impacts, you have to. My view is that you need to look at the impact of that specific cost and where that cost is. For example, I'm not entirely sure whether there is a loss-making version here, but let's take, for example, the coconut board. If there's a loss in the coconut board, what does that mean? Like, what is the cost of that loss? Is it going to be a big cost for the state banks? Is it going to be a big cost for the agriculture system, for the future of the agriculture system? And then you need to look at that cost specifically. So for me personally, a widespread privatization drive, for example, is not necessarily something that I think personally that Sri Lanka should go for. Also because it is very politically dicey, and that it can very easily lead to a lot of attention, a lot of political capital being used up for something that might not have a lot of positive impact in the long run. Because from comparing at overall expenditure of Sri Lanka, government expenditure of Sri Lanka versus other Asian countries, for example, Sri Lanka isn't really that high. It's actually the bottom 25%, as if I recall correctly. So as long as the costs of whatever that loss is is not very bad, I think there is a case to be made to fund that through higher tax revenue instead. But again, it's very much balancing that cost. I think the cost of CPC making billions of rupees in losses every day, and that has to be borne by the state banking system, is far worse, for example, of, let's say, someone making a million rupees a loss a year, and the cost of that is maybe much smaller, and that cost can be bridged through just a little bit of an increase in taxation. So I think those costs have to be looked at from an individual point by point basis. You should do everything you can to reduce those losses, of course, at every point. But whether the more drastic measure of privatization, in my personal view, is something that should be only a last option, a last resort option, when all other options have failed. Because again, that politically dicey nature means that I think it takes a lot of attention away from other things that can be far more critical in the short term, and political will, what people can bear, all of that is limited. So that's my personal view on that. Others can give their own as well.
Till you go.
Yeah, so I think one thing I would add to Chayu's one is, Chayu mentioned that Sri Lanka has, a low expenditure figure. But we also need to keep in mind that this is, the central government's expenditure figure that is low, including, transfers it does through the provincial councils. If we actually try to, estimate the expenditure to the overall public sector, which includes CPC, electricity board, which in a functional government system, the subsidies they're giving to the consumer needs to be moved from the budget to be paid to these entities so that they can be financially functional. So if you actually consider those subsidies should be properly a fiscal expenditure, then our fiscal expenditure would be higher. In countries like Indonesia, the petroleum subsidy used to be transferred from the budget to the the state connected retailers. So that is, that's really a problem in the system, because at the end the fiscal cost of that comes because over time the state banks will lose their capitalization, and the government needs to then capitalize them with a few billion every 8-10 years or so. So that is where the fiscal cost of that comes through. So we do need to consider that as well, while being aware that overall expenditure is lower than the average Asian country. Of course, another thing to look at, and the current political stability and the lack of political legitimacy in the government does not allow for a privatization drive, big privatization drive. That is a question, because people on in the protests will question, if the government is simply just making deals to make more money. So that is, of course, a problem to come in right now during the privatization. But on the other hand, is also needed to consider that we are asking our bilateral, multilateral partners, for bridging finance, while not trying to help ourselves. So one way of helping our situation is also coming up with a proper asset sale privatization plan, so that we can raise funding which is non-debt funding into the future, through certain strategic sales, or in sectors, especially in sectors that the government shouldn't really be in business, shouldn't really be the regulator and the entity in business. So in in those sectors where it's probably much more efficient for the government to be the regulator. For instance, the port terminals. Should the government be regulating and running those port terminals? That is, the next question. Yes, the government may be having captive revenue, non-tax revenue from that entity, but would it be more efficient if the terminals are run by more efficient terminal operators rather than the government itself? So those are the places where it needs to be considered, especially those downstream service sector or commercial entities that are involved. Things like electricity are much less willing to support full scale privatization of such a sector that then has which is also a natural monopoly. So that's my view. I think Umesh can also add in on that further. Chayu, I think you had something.
Yeah, I mean, just a small thing, just to I think, like I said, when you have these individual costs at different areas, we need to kind of, my view, compare those costs to the benefits of what you get. So I think Thilina gave a good explanation of like a few examples of areas that have actual costs associated with them, and those are the costs that we have to consider when we're talking about the cost of continuing on with the loss, for example. Is because it's not just the financial factor, it's not just the magnitude of the money, but it's also what that money means in terms of the cost overall outside of just that financial figure. So I think Thilina gave a good example of a few few examples of what those costs can look like, and things that might require greater reform than other things, and things we do need to prioritize over others.
Yeah, two things on the CPC and the SOE losses. When we talk about the SOE losses, significant part of it actually comes through Sri Lankan Airlines, CPC and CB, of which CPC and CB, because they provide at a subsidized cost, as you mentioned, you buy at 200 rupees and then you give it for 100 rupees, and because of this, the significant part of this benefit goes to the rich. So then it's a question: why do you need to subsidize rich and those who can pay, not only like the ultra rich, but also those who can pay, probably upper middle class and etc. So those who can pay lesser price, that has an impact on the budget, because as Thilina mentioned, then subsequently the government has to finance this either through the state banks or by giving cash transfers to the CPC or CP. So this cost sometimes, sometimes it comes for a year, comes about 50 billion, 60 billion for CPC. So this for one SOE, one big SOE, I can't remember which one, but the point is this is an equivalent to what we spend on Samurdhi for an entire year. So then we need to understand, okay, this has to shift, right? So that's first thing. And then when we talk about how do we get rid of it, or address this, I think it has to be deal in case basis. I also don't advocate for a uh, across the board privatization, and I also don't think that it is this government right now doing that would be the sensible thing to do. So it is important to treat everything case by case. As Thilina pointed out, ports is a good example. Why do we need state doing ports? I think the port terminals that operate as private-public partnerships, it is evident that they are doing really, really well. So it is important that certain things do with the private-public partnership and actually get rid of the narrative that this is actually quote-unquote selling state assets. Right? This is not selling per se. This is actually leasing for a certain period of time so that the state doesn't make a loss while private sector handles the operations together with the state. So if the state could decide what sort of stake that they can keep. And again, deal it in the case-by-case basis because also the transparency. For example, I actually was told by senior today that there were really a lot of issues in terms of what happened with privatization in 90s. For example, Sri Lanka Insurance Corporation, which was privatized, and then we had a Supreme Court decision of revising that privatization, right? So it is important that have the transparency process in the SOE reforms, making sure that you don't, do this and you wouldn't allow such things to happen, and but at the same time carry out the necessary reforms by focusing on what is the entity. Which I went to the extent of explaining by taking the coconut board and export for an example. Go same for like how do you want to reform the transport sector? How do you want to reform the Sri Lanka Transport Board or Sri Lanka Railway, which affects the lot of people who travel daily, right? So it's important to identify what this each SOE offers and make sure that what that particular subsidy or subsidy means, if subsidy is what causing the loss, or if something else is causing the loss, and address that root cause rather than go with a blanket view. Okay, we need to privatize or we need to sell or whatever. It's important that treat each case separately.
Yeah, on the energy subsidies, I think it's important, as you said, it does go. I mean, the net benefit is mostly consumed by the wealthier people in the country. So if you take, for example, the fuel subsidy, I think there was a World Bank report that said about 70% of the subsidy is by the top 30% households in terms of the income. So, I mean, it's only fair that we increase sort of the fuel prices because a lot of the subsidy is consumed by richer households, and we are talking about how do we make it more equitable. So it goes back to this cash transfer program that we are talking about, where we are actually taking we are cutting off these subsidies where the government is absorbing quite a big loss from, and then you're channeling that money towards giving relief to the people who really need it. And on SOEs, I think there are about 520 odd SOEs, and I do agree that there needs to be a case-by-case review. But there are certain commercial, SOEs that are involved in commercial activities, like, for example, travel agencies. We don't really need these SOEs, right? So I think for a certain bunch of them, I think the question of privatizing or shutting down is easier, but obviously when you're talking about the large SOEs like CEB and CPC and railways, and what do you do with that? That obviously needs a deeper look at. And I think on Sri Lankan airlines, I think there has been sort of things that have been recommended in terms of what should be done. So I think those are all worth looking at, and then trying to see how best we can approach, because we have to consider, I think, the debt that each of these SOEs have, and what is the contribution it makes to the economy, and what is the contribution it makes to the budget issues within the government. So I think these should be considered when we're talking about rationalizing which SOEs need to be shut down or which SOEs need to be privatized. There are any more questions? Doesn't seem to be. So, our Twitter space is almost now about 1.5 hours in, and it has been quite an interesting discussion. So, Umesh, Thilina, Chayu, if you want to share any closing remarks, I think after that we'll probably today.
Small remark. I think the coming time is going to be quite tough, and it's important that uh, making sure that there's not miscommunication about some of the reforms that may need to be carried out, and also making sure that that provide whatever support or to the government, not to the government, let's say to work towards immediate relief to those who are affected by the high cost of living and the crisis through whatever the social safety net program. And then yeah, so others, I think we'll have to, as the probably the middle class, will have to squeeze, some of the expenses. That I think it's important to acknowledge that we'll have to let go of some of the lifestyles that we were used to for a certain period of time, because it's not going to be feasible due to the situation that we are in.
Yeah, I mean, I'll also give my closing remarks on that same final point, but also put it in a slightly macabre relative sense. A lot of people, including, I mean, from the poorest down up all the way up to maybe not the richest of the rich, but to quite a lot of Sri Lankans will face a very difficult time in the period coming forward. For some people, it will be at the very basics that they will that they will struggle with, and that's where we really need to support them. Make sure that they get the basic food, basic medicine, the basic means to conduct their livelihoods. For example, that's like absolutely essential to make sure those things are either existent in the first place, there are no shortages, and then to deal with the price hikes, give them the direct support that we can, and you can use as many mechanisms as you can in order to get that support to them as well. But again, for everyone else, there will be, like Umesh said, lifestyle changes, and I mean that's bad. That sucks. Like I don't want to go through those lifestyle changes myself, but I'm telling myself, and this is, I think, a critical part of the thing that can be missed out, is that if not for these measures that we are taking, the lifestyle changes that someone would have had to take would have been far, far worse. If we were still under 13, 14 hour power cuts a day, very many people would, and no petrol, no diesel in the sheds, very many people would have lost their jobs because businesses would absolutely not have functioned, right? That's complete loss of income you're talking about. You're talking about medicine being in complete shortage, people dying because basic surgeries are that you can't get done. You're talking about basic food items either continuing to rise up in price as a result of that inflationary spiral driven by money printing, and whatever is there also being very, very, very there are a lot of shortages as well. So it is great that we avoided that. I think just avoiding that is a good accomplishment that we as population have achieved, because I do think that, like, my personal view is that the public protests were a key part in avoiding that terrible outcome. But it is great that we did that, but that doesn't mean that we fix everything, like we lose all the consequences of the policy decisions that brought us here. But it will be tough, but I am quite confident that once the next difficult period, year or so, is done, Sri Lanka will be on a path to recovery, and because of the adjustments that we're taking in our economy, that it'll be from a much better foundation, and that the long-term story of Sri Lanka's economic progress will be far, far better. And 15, 20 years down the line, I think all of us can look back, or rather, yeah, look back and say, look, Sri Lanka today is at a much better place than it was in the in the 2010s, in the 2020s, for example. And I think that long-term growth story for Sri Lanka will remain strong, and it's something to look forward to even in the middle of all this darkness.
I think I missed a small point in terms of when I was talking about SOE, so I'll connect that to my to my wrap up itself. So I think with the SOE, the one big issue that we had, especially in the 90s, 2000s, was the modality in which the privatizations, the asset sales happen, where you had this big deal happening, where one big investor comes in, pays 100 million, 500 million, and that it's like a big sexy deal to get that done. And it's like one thing off, and then those creates a bit of problems. It's much more complex, to do kind of spinning off subsidiaries, getting joint venture partners, from the local private sector, listing out SOEs. That's a very, very complex, not so sexy. It's a hard task to get through. And it's the same thing with the other reforms that Sri Lanka will also need to get through. getting parliamentary committees that function properly, that have actual teeth to take action, having things like, revenue boards or tax commissions or whatever that will, cadre commissions that manage the salary levels, wage commissions, etc., which will, put in more a reliable policy, more responsible policy over time. Those aren't really, very attractive, very fancy things. They will take time. There's a lot of bureaucracy involved in those. But that is the kind of things that we need to get through if Sri Lanka is to, be on a get on a stable path and a sustainable path in the long run.
Thanks, Thilina. Yeah, just my closing thoughts on this is that I think all of us should. I think that these, if you look back at some of the root causes of, the reason we are here, for example, the erosion of institutional frameworks, the erosion of, parliamentary due process. So I think all of us should aim to champion sort of the legal and institutional frameworks and put them back in place so that we don't end up in a situation where, one person can derail the entire country. And I think that is going to be probably very key when we are talking about the medium and the longer term reforms that the country needs to take, particularly with respect to state-owned enterprises, which is, as all the Chayu and the others also mentioned, which is pretty politically dicey. So I think that's something probably all of us should, keep in mind, and as responsible citizens, that's something we should champion. So it has been a very, very interesting discussion. I just like to thank all of you for joining in and asking questions and engaging with us. I'd invite all of you to continue to engage with us. You can tweet at us. You can ask us questions on. Continue to ask us questions on Twitter. So just like to thank everyone for joining us, and hope everyone has a good night. Thank you.
A stable path and a sustainable path in the long run.
Thanks, Thilina. Yeah, just my closing thoughts on this is that I think all of us should. I think that if you look back at some of the root causes of, the reason we are here, for example, the erosion of institutional frameworks, the erosion of, parliamentary process, due process. So I think all of us should aim to champion sort of the legal and institutional frameworks and put them back in place so that we don't end up in a situation where, one person can derail the entire country. And I think that is going to be probably very key when we are talking a country. And I think that is going to be probably very key when we are talking about the medium and the longer term reforms that the country needs to take, particularly with respect to state-owned enterprises, which is, as all the Chayu and the others also mentioned, which is pretty politically dicey. So I think that's something probably all of us should, keep in mind, and as responsible citizens, that's something we should champion. So it has been a very, very interesting discussion. I just like to thank all of you for joining in and asking questions and engaging with us. I'd invite all of you to continue to engage with us. You can tweet at us. You can ask us questions on continue to ask us questions on Twitter. So just like to thank everyone for joining us, and hope everyone has a good night. Thank you.